trust all of you can see this.
Yes, we have it.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So I thought that it would be good to start with the cover of the book. And you may, those of you who know women and history and Civil War may wonder why vivandières is on the cover of a book about nurses. And I wanted to take you, give you a look at the full image of Marie Tepe, better known as French Mary to many. She was connected first to, I believe it was 27th Pennsylvania and later to the 114th Pennsylvania Infantry. My favorite quote of hers is apparently something that she spoke to an officer on horseback while they were before Fredericksburg, and the officer was telling her to basically get off the battlefield and get to safety. And she reportedly looked at him and said, "Maybe I'm not so scared as you are," and of course made no sign of obedience. And apparently thereafter she was suffered a slight wound in the ankle. Her story is such a legend and part of the mythology of the Civil War. Knowing where the balance is between truth and fiction is a bit hard to get at in her case. But there's a reason why she's on the cover, and that's because I cast a rather large net in trying to define what a Civil War nurse was. I ultimately put them into two broad categories. There's a grouping that I think of as paid and volunteer nurses, matrons, relief workers, caregivers, into that larger category. And then there's another category after that who I call the freelancers. And Marie is certainly in the freelancer category. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I wanted to start out by giving you a sort of a broad overview of how I see the world of nursing fit in to the Civil War period. And as many of you know, nursing is not nearly as organized as it was today, or as it is today, and certainly not nearly as organized as the military was during the war period. And so what you're going to see, or what you see on the bottom here in these circles, is my visualization of the sort of the main categories, the main opportunities that women had to become involved in nursing. And you'll see these first two circles are divided in half, blue and gray, to represent opportunities for Southern women as well as Northern women. So the first circle that you see is involvement with the Union and Confederate armies. Women had a role to play in both of those armies. The next circle is city and state charities, and women, of course, were very active in both of those, both levels of charity, whether it was collecting supplies, collecting money, all of the kind of activities that you would consider attached to a philanthropic activity. The last three circles are really unique to the Union Army. The third and fourth circles are the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the Western Sanitary Commission, who many of you probably know from the sanitary fair photographs that were sold to make money. And of course, the level and complexity of those organizations during the course of the war became huge, sprawling, and they did amazing services, provided amazing services for the Union Army and the Union Navy. The last circle is the U.S. Christian Commission, and they were very similar to the sanitary commissions. Of course, they had another objective, which was to also help you find your path to God and to religion. So I want to focus just a little bit on, of all of these, of the 5 circles, one of the ones that fascinated me the most was the city and state charities, particularly the cities and towns. These were local groups, local women who were making socks, collecting lint to make bandages, collecting money, having organized activities to be able to raise money for the troops. And particularly a lot of paths that I've discovered in the Union Army sort of look like this. You'd have these local and state charities, and then you would have someone, a woman who was functioning in the role as a nurse or an agent, and they were pretty much helping to distribute goods and materials, and in some cases, winding up on the battlefield or in a hospital, being able to provide services to wounded men, sometimes from their state, sometimes from their locality, other times getting caught up in the larger series of events as the war exploded beyond anyone's imagination. You'll see here on this last slide in this group, I've added some arrows going back and forth because in some cases you had these nurses / agents who were communicating back and forth with their towns to get more goods and more supplies. They would get them sent to a base of operations and they would deliver them. One great example is Clara Barton. That's more or less how she got started. That other category that I was talking about up front that involves Marie Tepe, these are the freelancers. And these are the vivandières. These are the mothers of the regiment, the daughters of the regiment. These are individuals who were more or less outside the system of the paid and volunteer system. And they were really working within the regiment. They might have a husband, they might have a boyfriend, they might have sons who were involved in the regiment. And when the regiment left town, they went with them. Or in some cases, after, for example, a son may have come down with an illness, the mother would then go down to camp and basically get enmeshed in all of the events. And during the war, because nursing isn't quite as organized, there's room for all of these individuals and all of these types. There's a lot of freedom, and a lot of these negotiations are happening on the, I'll call it the local level of the regiments, where you've got the colonels who are making decisions to allow folks into camp and not allow them in camp. And so this is my way of saying that there's sort of a complex net. By the end of the war, things are certainly becoming more organized, but in that early part of the war, it's a little bit wild. And that, of course, can be a great opportunity for many, or it can be really discouraging to others. I think this is also a good illustration to sort of get your head around nursing, or the way that I see nursing during the Civil War. There's no uniform, really. Now, some of you may immediately think of Dorothea Dix, and you'd be right. Dorothea putting out her strict regulations, calling for drab clothing and a certain demeanor, and not encouraging ostentatious displays of any kind, was certainly of a type, but I don't think that you could fairly call it a uniform. So these four women here, I think, are wearing all the kind of garb that you might see, and you could call it some sort of a quasi-uniform. Marie over on the left, she's wearing the classic French cantiniere or vivandière. She has her canteen, which we assume was filled with water. She has, in this case, a revolver and a holster. She is wearing a dress with pants and boots, a bonnet. She's wearing a zouave because she was in a zouave regiment. You can see the tombeau on her jacket, the close buttons that are there. She has the kind of uniform that is sort of an Americanized version of what you might have seen in France a few years earlier during the Crimean War. Helen Gilson is next to Marie. And of this group, I think she's probably the closest to getting Dorothea Dix's approval. She's wearing a little bit of ornamentation around the bottom of her dress and her collar and her cuffs, but for the most part, and her pockets, for the most part, it's a fairly standard, it's not the kind of silk showy gown that you're going to see in a ballroom or see in perhaps a levee in Washington or something like that. Next to Helen is Mary Morris' husband, and Mary is wearing an apron that she designed, and her right hand, which almost looks like it's missing, it's actually sitting in a pocket. She's resting it in a pocket. And those very, very large pockets, she would load up with items for soldiers as she went around the hospitals. And so it was a very functional apron, tight-fitting, but yet roomy to allow her to carry things back and forth to the wards. Pardon me. The last woman in this group, Sister Ignatius Farley, is representative of women of religious orders who wore their gowns, who wore their garb, no matter what situation. And certainly in a hospital, you would see a Catholic nun like Sister Farley dressed like this. Now, it's also hard for me to imagine that some significant number of these women were not familiar with Florence Nightingale. It seems impossible to me, and yet I found few references to Florence Nightingale in the research that I did. But I do think that Florence Nightingale's book, which is called Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not, which came out in the very late 1850s, certainly coincident with the Civil War, has to be a connection. I love this quote from her book. She says, "Every woman, or at least almost every woman in England, has, at one time or another of her life, has charge of the personal health of somebody, whether child or invalid. In other words, every woman is a nurse." That last part of this, that last part of her quote, "every woman is a nurse," that I think is pervasive. You see this throughout the Civil War and all of the women. Some have no more than the very basics of training, as Florence Nightingale is describing here. Others, it runs the gamut. You've got folks who maybe were educated about health on the farm with some books, maybe a local doctor. And then you've got folks who graduated from college and have medical degrees. And so a wide range. Of course, there's more women in that category of the country nurse than the degreed women. Now, Florence Nightingale, as many of you know, she becomes, her claim to fame, what really gets her thinking and writing is the Crimean War. And so between 1853 and 1856, you've got the war in the Crimea, and folks like Mrs. Rogers, whom I haven't researched, but a great photograph of her with soldiers, sort of a precursor to the Civil War and the role of women. Now, to sort of get at my point earlier about women in America being familiar with Florence Nightingale, I did a survey of newspaper mentions of Florence Nightingale between 1854, which is the first year into the Crimean War, until 1865. And keep in mind, her book comes out in 1859, and then there's an American version of that in 1860. And so this is not, this study is not complete because I'm at the mercy of the newspapers that are on newspapers.com, which was my source. But you can see the name Florence Nightingale jumps up. By the end of the Crimean War, you've got 722 mentions, and then it begins to dip. Her book comes out in 1859, and then boom, in 1860 is the highest, the height of her references in newspapers is in 1860, and of course, the war is happening in 1861. Now, in that 1860 American edition, in the back, I believe, there's a biographical sketch of her, and my guess is that it was intended for Americans who might not have heard of her, of Florence Nightingale, and this quote captures my attention. I want to share it with you. Surely, if there was heroism in dashing up the heights of Alma, seeking glory at the cannon's mouth in defiance of death and of all mortal opposition, amid the shouts of the victors and the cries of the vanquished, there was heroism unparalleled in calmly volunteering to minister to the fever-stricken and the dying. This is important because Florence Nightingale, this biographical sketch is pretty much saying women's work as nurses is equal to your heroics on the battlefield, Mr. Soldier. That's powerful stuff in 1860. Now, let's take this a little bit forward and put the same, let's move the timeline just a little bit, just a couple years into the war. And here you have Georgiana Bacon, Georgie, as she was known to her friends. And she is describing later in life from her collected letters about all the trials and the tribulations that she faced as a nurse. And you can read it here. And she says, no one knows who did not watch the thing from the beginning, how much opposition, how much ill will, how much unfeeling want of thought these women nurses endured. Hardly a surgeon, that I can think of, received or treated them with even common courtesy. So here's Georgie is talking about the hopeful happiness, the wishful thoughts, the positive experience of Florence Nightingale. Boom, during the war, you're immediately running into the hostility of basically the medical establishment. And so this sounds like a tragic ending, but it's not, because Georgie continues her story. And she says, or her quote, she says, these annoyances could not have been endured by the nurses, but for the knowledge that they were pioneers who were, if possible, to gain standing ground for others who must create the position they wish to occupy. So if that isn't a ray of sunshine, if that is not following in the Florence Nightingale tradition, it's the spirit of we will overcome. We are going to make our way. We are going to help. We are going to participate in the war, and we're going to do it in our own way. Of course, a face that I imagine most of you are very familiar with, Clara Barton. She is, of course, talking about of memory, of American memory, and talking about the part of war that most people don't really think about and don't talk about. In some way, it's getting back to Florence Nightingale's comments about the soldiers at Alma and the women who were working behind the scenes to take care of them. This is the same spirit from Clara Barton. And of course, she ends this beautiful quote with saying, "This is the side of history which never shows." And that was a big motivation for me to be able to research and write the book and find the photographs, because when Clara Barton is more or less throwing down the gauntlet, I'm going to pick it up. Not to say that many other scholars have. I'm just one of many who have done this work, but my focus has been on the photography as well as the stories, and I'll get into the photography in just a little bit. I mentioned Clara Barton. I mentioned, and Clara Barton, of course, the angel, starts the Red Cross after the war, revered by so many. In many ways, I feel like she's sort of picking up from Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix, known as the Dragon, she is hardcore. She's wanting to set up law and order. She's taking on the medical establishment. She's working in Washington to get the Union Army nurses organized. And she's a powerful force. She makes a lot of friends. She makes a lot of enemies. By the end of the war, her star is certainly risen and is now on the slow decline. Always respected, but a force to be reckoned with, but also a bit of a troubling character. And I want to point out that these women are mentioned at many points in the book, but I did not include their profiles because you get a sense of them through the profiles of the women who have not really had voices to any large extent. So Clara and Dorothea, with all due respect, they have had many moments in the sun, so we're going to give the others a chance for their due. Now, I want to talk a little bit about photography, which is a big part of the book. Every story in the book is illustrated with an original wartime photograph of the person. That was really important to me to be able to achieve that because I wanted readers to be able to make that visual connection between a face and the story of that person. I know it can be rather simplistic on a level. I'm showing you their face, I'm giving you their story, but there's a real visual power and a textual power when you read their narratives and are able to see, look into their eyes. So all of these women, all of the whole American generation, I think you can really say that they're also the photography generation. Photography is only 22 years old. Most of them have grown up with it, or it came into their lives during their young adult or adult years. And to give you a sense, when photography was invented in 1839, Abe Lincoln is 30, Frederick Douglass is 21, Clara Barton, 18, Ulysses S. Grant is 17, your average Civil War soldier is 4, and George Armstrong Custer, the baby, was 1. And I always chuckle about that because of this group, he was really one that made a lot. He sort of recognized the power of photography and used it to his great advantage. And he grew up with it for his entire life. All credit due to Daguerre. Those of you who know photography probably know the daguerreotype. And so you may also know the face of this man, Daguerre, who was the person who, building on the success of others who were fascinated with phosphorus chemicals, with the camera obscura, and with capturing a likeness. He's the one who came up with a commercially successful way to do that. And of course, he's recognized throughout history for being that person. The French, his home country, made the invention an open gift to the world for everyone to practice. The intersection of science, of art, of chemistry, of meteorology, it's all coming together here. For purposes of this story, Many people, of course, come between Daguerre and the Civil War generation. One of the photographers who had a tremendous impact on photography is diaries. And diaries invents, he patents, another patent here, he patents an interesting camera. And this camera ultimately commercially has 4 lenses, as you can see here. And the lenses are taking 4 images on a glass plate that can be cut into quarters, and those images can be developed onto printed paper and then pasted onto a cardboard mount. These images are called cartes de visite, or visiting cards. And at first, after the patent is registered in 1854, it's sort of slow to catch on. But 2 major events, May of 1859 in Paris, you have the Emperor Napoleon III and the Empress Eugenie, who have their carte de visite made in a Paris studio. And of course, the French public wants to have their likeness made in the very same way. So we have an explosion of the carte de visite in Paris. That rapidly spreads to England. The following summer of 1860, you've got these well-known folks, Victoria and Albert, who are having their carte de visite portraits made. And next thing you know, it's already actually coming to America, but between France and England, they set America on fire. And by January to March of 1861, you're beginning to see advertisements in American newspapers for carte de visite photography. And cartes de visite wind up being called and thought of as Cardomania. I'm not making up this term. This is actually from the period. It's all the rage in America. It's all the rage in Europe. It's a craze. These baseball card size photographs that are making the rounds across the country. And here's one. They fit in your hand. These are personal objects. These are the kinds of images that you're going to study in your parlor with your friends. These are the kind of images that you're going to gossip on. You're going to look at the faces and have, and sometimes you're going to laugh, sometimes you're going to cry. It's entertainment in a way. And so these little images have a great personal power buried inside of them. Compared to the daguerreotype and other formats that you may have heard of, I know you've heard of the tintype. There's also the ambrotype. The carte de visite is different because it's on paper versus the other hard plate images, as collectors call them. They're known for really 3 things. They're affordable. They're really cheap. You can get a dozen for $1, $1.50. They're reproducible. If you want more, go to your local photographer. They have the glass negative on display or on file. They'll make as many as you want. Tens, hundreds, thousands. By the dozen, they'll make you more. Of course, they're shareable. You can give them to your friends. You can give them to your family. You can give them to your comrades. You can do so many things with them. Also, personalization. Because they're on paper, you can easily flip them over and write on them. You can write letters. As you can see here, you can write notations about what was going on and the images on the other side. They were used for marriage licenses, a wide variety of purposes. So personalization is really an important element of these photographs. Harder to do with daguerreotypes, tintypes, and ambrotypes. Another thing that's important to know about the carte de visite, it's democratization, in a word. You can be next to a famous person. That's democracy. You are of equal visual importance. I'm sitting on a table next to President Lincoln. My photograph is with his. That's about as American as it gets. Not a surprise to any of you that It's the birth of photo albums. And what I just described is really the Facebook of the 1860s. Keep in mind, in the 1850s and 1860s, we're going through a mass media, an explosion. The telegraph, newspapers, photography, and social media. This is the social media of the 1860s. To give you a sense of how big cartes de visite became during the war, you can follow these colored bars. Daguerreotypes, the original photograph, ambrotypes, tintypes, the green, the gold, the blue. You will see that those bars are declining in numbers. And this is, again, citations on newspapers.com, whereas the red bar, the CDVs, as we call them, as collectors call them, or cartes de visite, that bar is growing dramatically in size. So the period of the Civil War is also a great period of change as far as photograph technologies and formats are concerned, as the CDV, or the carte de visite, is ramping up and basically capturing the markets. Not a surprise, the great man of letters, Oliver Wendell Holmes, says famously in 1863, card portraits, as everybody knows, have become the social currency, the sentimental greenbacks of civilization. Now, just to give you a sense of scale, in England alone, according to Darrow's landmark book on Civil War cartes de visite, 300 to 400 million were sold every year between 1861 and 1867 in England. Now, I did some calculations, conservative calculations, to take Union Army, 2.5 million, and do a little bit of math. A bunch of guys got their photographs taken after they enlisted, some number during the middle of the war, and then those who survived, maybe a last shot at the end of the war. And so, according to my estimate, I came up with 40 million images of soldiers alone. I am not talking about the generals. I'm not talking about Abraham Lincoln, the famous politicians, just the soldiers alone, 40 million images. And to get to a question or a topic that Rich, I think, brought up while we were talking, or maybe it was Dave, actually, I think that may have asked this. They're not, they're still out there. They're not all found. By my calculations, if only 10% of those images survived, there's 4 million soldier images alone, plus countless tens of millions of images of American civilians, all of them with amazing stories to tell. Here's a little bit of context. If you think that's big, every 2 minutes, according to one source, we take as many photos as the total taken in the entire 19th century. So maybe not quite as big as you're thinking, but still a lot of images. One of the great things about photography of this period, because of the democratization, the personalization, the shareability, the reproducibility, the affordability, you have an amazing visual document of life in America during that time period. And I wanted to show you just a couple of images that document women during the 1860s. A group of athletes, exercise. There was an exercise craze going on during the war. This group, you'd call this an occupational photo, milliners with hats and various millinery goods on the back steps of perhaps a business in Corning, New York. This woman, don't know who she is, sitting with her hands crossed. Some friends. And this one simply inscribed on the back, 101 years. She's in her bed with a fan. So there's uncounted numbers of these images that are out there that document the personal lives, the individual faces of Americans. Now, take the last part of the presentation, and then happy to answer your questions to look at. I want you to meet some of the nurses. Just a little bit of context. There's 77 nurses altogether in the book. I spent a good chunk of time, probably about 2 years, tracking down all the photographs. I got a jump start by a single collector named Chris Ford, who is in Delaware. And the book and my research probably would not have happened without him. He's been collecting for, I believe, 40 years or so, and completely focused on Civil War nursing, has amassed a collection of 3,000 plus documents, photographs only part of that. And in 2014, I first met Chris, and then in 2015, we did a gallery of representative images in Military Images magazine. And when I saw his collection, which he brought over to my house in a big plastic bin, and after I went crazy because there were so many unique images, I knew in my heart that there was a book that needed to be done about the services and sacrifices of these women. So with that preface, I want to introduce you to just a few of them. There's a combination of images and stories that really caught my attention. This is Elmira Fales, a long journey before the Civil War from New York to Iowa to Washington, D.C. She buries a couple husbands along the way, marries a husband that winds up getting an appointment in Washington. They moved to Washington some years before the war. They rent out their house to boarders, sort of a footnote in history. One of her boarders is a young Clara Barton who has come to Washington. And after the election of President Lincoln, her reaction is she begins collecting lint to make bandages. Her friends and neighbors begin to worry about her. They don't know what's going on. And she knows that the election of Lincoln means a long and bloody war. She's almost clairvoyant in this. And so she reacts by making supplies. I love her commitment, and what she saw a full, months before Fort Sumter is powerful stuff. The photograph here is also of interest because she's carrying baskets. And time again during my research, the idea or the references to nurses carrying baskets as they move through wards, it's either baskets or pockets. And so I think she's a representative image of that. So, and she's completely indefatigable, just going on and on and on in hospitals and doing her business. Sally Dicer, she's pictured on the left. I happen to love this image. It's so personal during a time when the images could be rather stiff, when they still used metal rods to lock your head into position. This is a very casual, has a very nice quality to it. She's posed with two of her friends, Annie Bell and Sarah Chamberlain, who both go on to become nurses. Sally is a student, and she is in Harrisburg, PA, when Lincoln is coming to town on his inaugural train trip. And the president stops, makes a few comments, and her gut reaction to that moment, she says, all that was good was with him. There was no bad. And that propels her to become a nurse. And she's at Gettysburg, she's in Tennessee, putting in all of her energy, her heart and soul into being a nurse. Just give you a sense of the variety here. You've got on maybe the complete opposite side of the spectrum of young, impressionable Sally, you've got Catherine Lawrence. She comes out of New York. She's got these, she's a hardcore activist, temperance, women's suffrage. She's a reformer. She's out there early on. And by the time of the Civil War, she's all in. And she comes to Washington, pushes her way into Dorothea Dix's nursing corps, gets on the wrong side of Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix winds up more or less assigning Catherine, or Kit as she's known to her friends, to the worst possible hospitals in the DC area. And Kit survives all of this. Along the way, in one of her assignments, she's greeting refugees, slave children who are coming in from Northern Virginia. And among one group are 3 children that are more white, more white than they are black in their appearance, including this young woman, Fanny, who Catherine is posed with. Kit actually adopts these 3 young women, takes sort of a special connection, a special liking to Fanny, ultimately travels to New York, gets a big story in newspapers there, and then goes on to taking Fanny around to northern cities to tell their story and raise money. Back on the other side of the spectrum, young, inexperienced Mary Jane Safford. She finds herself, she has a rich brother who made his money, and she's in Cairo, Illinois, at the start of the war, and the Battle of Belmont, Missouri is not far from where she is. And there's a wonderful story of this young woman who is out after the battle, and she has a homemade flag, a white rag, hanging from a pole, and she's with an African-American man, and together they're walking through the aftermath of the Battle of Belmont, helping all of the wounded men, and helping to give them relief, and helping to get them to makeshift hospitals. Mary Jo's story, she becomes known, as you'll see by the subtext or subhead here, the Cairo Angel, because she becomes a sort of an ever-present figure to help organize a hospital. She has no idea what she's doing. She's just going with her gut instincts, and she helps to organize this hospital, and meets and greets, cares for people, and she eventually, after the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862, she's so exhausted that she's on the verge of collapse and death. Her brother more or less rescues her and sends her to Europe to recover her health, and she's gone for the rest of the war. She doesn't come back until 1866. But her story, someone who really got in early and gave her all, I see that over and over and over again in these stories. Here's another woman who gives her all. This is Anna Marie Ross, and from Philadelphia. If you've been over to the GAR headquarters and museum, you'll see a big circular portrait of Anna Marie there. And so you may be familiar with her story. She's very active in the Cooper Shop Hospital, which is part of the Cooper Shop Volunteer Refreshment Saloon. And she's a driving force behind organizing this hospital. This is in mid to late 1861. She gets involved, and for months and months, she works hard to make this a reality. Finally, on December 22nd, 1863, they're having the dedication ceremony for this new hospital. Absent from the ceremony is Anna Marie, the person who put so much of her life into this. She literally worked herself to death, and she died on the day that the dedication ceremony took place. Never saw it come to fruition. Gave her life in service of establishing a hospital for sick and wounded Union soldiers. You met Mary Moore's husband a little bit earlier. Soldiers in the hospitals would refer to her pockets full of miracles, pulling out chessboards, books. She would walk around the wards and the soldiers would say, oh, you know, if only I had a pen and some paper or a certain book that they were interested in. She would make notes of all of this and she would acquire the items, stuff them in her pockets, and then on one of her rounds, she would distribute the items to the soldiers. So really an enduring figure. At Smoketown Hospital, at the Antietam battlefield, she's sharing a tent with a fellow nurse. They have a double wide tent. And she makes a flagpole out of, I don't know what she used for the flagpole, but out of red calico, she cuts a medicine bottle and she hangs it. That's her flag. She makes her own flag. You already know she made her own apron. She makes her own calico red flag to advertise her services as a nurse and someone who can dispense medicine to make life just a little bit more bearable. Helen Gilson, you also met her earlier. She's the one who's wearing the sort of drab outfit that I think would have made Dorothy and Dix happy. You'll see her headline here, Where Others Dared Not Go. Despite all of the courage and conviction of these women of the times, they were still women of their time. And the separation between white and black folks was still very much a big part of the Northern and Southern culture. So much so that in 1864 in Virginia, there was a, after some of the battles down there, the US colored troops were coming back wounded and some sick from battle, and they collected in a place and had no one to care for them. They might have had the regimental surgeon or an assistant surgeon, but no one would help these poor men. And Helen Gilson is, no surprise, she's the one that stepped up. She basically says, the men were neglected, the hospital organization was imperfect, the mortality was consequently large, and she determined she was going to do something about it, and do it she did. Now, on the Southern side, I mentioned up front, or in my earlier comments about nurses, how the Union enjoyed the Sanitary Commission, the Western Sanitary Commission, the Christian Commission. On the Southern side, you've got Felicia Ann Grundy, and someone said of her, she was second to no woman in the South. And she was in Nashville, born and raised. She's the daughter of Felix Grundy, who is a respected former senator in the early days of the Republic. And so she's got some clout. She organizes early on in the war. And of course, when her home city becomes occupied by the Union, she remains in town. She continues to serve Confederates in any way she can. There's some correspondence that she has with Richmond with an idea of starting up a larger organization for supplies. Basically, she's proposing the Southern or the Confederate equivalent of a US Sanitary Commission. But because of the resources, because the Southern territory is being invaded, it never comes to light. It's no more than a dream. And I think that also illustrates the common problem, the challenge to the South throughout the war. They did not have the resources to do the kind of things that the North was able to do. So Sister Ignatius Farley, you also met her. She's in Wheeling, West Virginia, or at the time, Virginia up to a certain point, with the Sisters of St. Joseph. And her church becomes a hospital. And there's this lovely quote that the hospital is filled with soldiers. Her and her sisters, not only sister nurses, but sisters in the Catholic faith, they take refuge in one of the anterooms. They're basically working to exhaustion, like Mary Jo, Anna Marie, all those other women. And she describes a scene one night when she looks into the anteroom and sees her sisters. And she says, I stood fascinated by the unusual picture of 7 professed sisters worn out from severe hospital duty who were lying asleep on the floor, and, soldier fashion, each sister was enfolded in a blanket, while each weary head was resting upon a pillow made of leaves gathered on the campus. Over the sleeping group, which included the superior, Mother de Chantal, there rested the soft, roseate glow from the sanctuary lamp, gleaming through the glass panels of the closed door, and there was still lingering the delicate fragrance of the incense used in the adjoining chapel during the evening benediction. What a powerful moment, and the description of the smells on top of it and the leaves as pillows just will stay with me forever. Another woman, another religious woman, Sybil Jones, she and her husband are stars. They're celebrities in the Quaker faith, traveling the United States, traveling in Europe before the war. She's the charismatic speaker. He's the biblical scholar. Together, they are dynamite. When the war begins, their son enlists. He decides to fight. And this, of course, goes against the grain of the very essence of the Friends in the Quaker faith. And so despite these intense differences within the family, the split, they all do continue to correspond. And then after their son is killed in battle at Fort Stevens in Washington, D.C., the battle that many of you know because Lincoln rides out and almost gets shot, she then goes on a tour. Up to this point, she's not involved as a nurse. She's still professing her Quaker faith and speaking around the country. She then becomes involved, goes on a tour of hospitals in Washington and Virginia. I'm going to leave you with one more, and this is Rosanna Billing. And she's considered the classic description, right? She's considered frail. You can see she has her glasses on here. Her parents don't want her to go to be a nurse, but she's determined. She winds up in Falls Church, Virginia, and Fredericksburg, ultimately at Annapolis at the hospital there. And she sees these survivors from Andersonville, these skeletal soldiers, come back and cares for them. At some point, she herself falls ill with typhoid. And in January 1865, she passes. Word of her commitment, her concern, has become something of the stuff of legend by that time, and it spreads throughout the nursing corps in that part of the country. And it even makes its way to a male nurse in Washington, someone you know very well, Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman has this to say about her. He says, a lady named Miss or Mrs. Billing, who has long been a practical friend of soldiers and a nurse in the Army, and had become attached to it in a way that no one can realize but him or her who has had experience, was taken sick early this winter, lingered some time, and finally died in the hospital. It was her request that she should be buried among the soldiers and after military method. Her coffin was carried to the grave by soldiers with the usual escort and a salute fired over the grave. That's Rosanna Billing. And this is the end of the presentation. As I mentioned, some of you up front, if you, and I can share this information later, as a thank you for participating tonight, if you're interested in getting a signed copy of the book, you can go to shopmilitaryimages.com, use the promo code Old Baldy, and save 10%.